You're alone in the kitchen, narrating what you're doing under your breath. Okay, where did I put the... Oh, there it is. If someone walked in, you'd probably feel a little caught. But talking to yourself out loud isn't a quirky habit or a sign something's off. It's actually one of the more quietly impressive things your brain does. And today, we're breaking down exactly why some people do it constantly and others almost never do. Let's clear up the biggest misconception first, because it's a persistent one. Talking to yourself out loud has nothing to do with loneliness or instability. In fact, it's the opposite of a problem. Self-directed speech, the technical term for this, is a documented cognitive strategy that actually improves performance on certain kinds of tasks. People who narrate what they're doing while searching for something, for instance, tend to find it faster than people who search silently. Saying it out loud isn't random noise. It's your brain using an extra channel to organize itself. Here's the mechanism underneath it. Vocalizing a thought engages more of your brain than simply thinking it silently does. It recruits your auditory processing alongside your language centers, essentially giving you a second pass at the same information, hearing it as well as thinking it. This is part of why saying something out loud can suddenly clarify a thought that felt tangled when it was just circling silently in your head. The extrasensory loop forces a kind of structure that pure internal thought doesn't always provide on its own. This actually traces back to something fascinating in developmental psychology. Young children talk to themselves out loud constantly while playing or solving problems, a phenomenon psychologists call private speech. For decades, this was seen as a phase kids simply grow out of, but later research reframed it entirely. Children aren't outgrowing this ability, they're internalizing it, gradually turning outer speech into the silent inner monologue most adults default to. People who still talk to themselves out loud as adults haven't failed to fully internalize this process. They've simply kept access to an earlier, often more effective version of it, especially under certain conditions. Let's pause here for a second, because here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Think about the last time you talked yourself through something complicated out loud. Maybe assembling furniture, working through a tricky problem, rehearsing what you were about to say before an important call. Did it actually help? For most people who do this, the answer is a clear yes, and that's not a coincidence. Here's when this tends to happen most, and it's not random at all. Self-talk spikes specifically during tasks that require sequencing, complex, multi-step processes where you need to track what's already being done and what's coming next. Cooking, organizing, troubleshooting, packing for a trip. These are exactly the situations where talking yourself through it out loud tends to appear most naturally, because the vocalization is functioning almost like a working memory extension, holding information in a more stable, externalized form than silent thought alone can manage. There's also an emotional regulation function worth understanding, because it's just as important as the cognitive one. People often talk to themselves out loud specifically during moments of frustration or stress, not as a sign of losing control, but as an actual regulation strategy. Hearing your own voice narrate a difficult moment out loud, okay, this is annoying, but I can figure this out, can genuinely lower physiological stress markers compared to letting the same thoughts spiral silently and unchecked. The vocalization acts almost like having a calm, outside voice, except it's coming from inside you. Here's something that might surprise you. Research has found that people who talk to themselves out loud in the third person, using their own name instead of I, during stressful situations, tend to show even stronger emotional regulation benefits. Something about the linguistic distance, referring to yourself the way you'd refer to someone else, creates a small amount of psychological space between you and the stress, similar to the kind of distance a supportive friend's voice might offer, except entirely self-generated. Let's talk about why some people do this far more than others, because there's real individual variation here worth understanding. It's linked partly to general cognitive style. People who process verbally rather than visually tend to lean on self-talk more heavily. simply because language is their primary tool for organizing thought in the first place. It's also linked to how much time someone spends alone, since self-talk out loud requires an environment where it feels safe to do so, and people with more solitary routines simply have more uninterrupted opportunity for it to surface naturally. There's a social layer worth naming too, because plenty of people who talk to themselves out loud have learned to suppress it around others, out of a reasonable fear of seeming strange. This suppression is worth questioning a little, because a skill that measurably helps focus, memory, and emotional regulation is being quietly hidden due to social discomfort rather than any actual downside. The habit isn't the problem. The stigma around it is doing more harm than the behavior itself ever did. It's worth being clear about where the line actually is, because there is a legitimate distinction to understand. The self-talk we're describing here is intentional or semi-intentional, narrating tasks, working through problems, regulating emotion, generally something the person is aware of and could stop if they chose to. This is categorically different from involuntary, distressing internal experiences that feel imposed rather than chosen, which is a separate topic entirely and not what typical self-talk represents for the vast majority of people who do it. Let's talk about how this trait shows up specifically at work, because it's more common in professional settings than people admit out loud, pun intended. Programmers famously talk through code out loud, sometimes even to an inanimate object sitting on their desk, a practice popular enough to have its own name, rubber duck debugging, where the simple act of vocalizing a problem to something that can't respond forces a clarity that silent thinking often can't reach. This isn't a coding-specific phenomenon either. It works for almost any complex problem, because the mechanism, forcing thought into structured sequential language, doesn't care what field you're in. There's also an interesting angle here around performance and rehearsal. People preparing for a difficult conversation, a presentation, or a negotiation often talk through it out loud beforehand, sometimes pacing while doing it. This isn't just nervous energy. Vocal rehearsal engages motor memory and auditory feedback in a way that silent mental rehearsal doesn't, which is part of why the version you eventually say out loud in the real conversation tends to come out smoother if you've practiced it audibly first, rather than only running it silently in your head. It's also worth mentioning the developmental piece a bit further, because it explains a lot about who kept this ability into adulthood. Children whose caregivers responded warmly to their out-loud narration during play, rather than shushing it as strange or disruptive, often retained more comfort with self-talk later in life. In households where speaking to yourself was quietly discouraged, treated as something to grow out of quickly, kids tend to push the habit underground faster. Not because the cognitive benefit disappeared, but because the social cost of continuing it outweighed the private usefulness. So if you're someone who talks to yourself constantly, here's the reframe worth taking with you. You're not behind everyone else in some social skill of keeping thoughts silent. You're using a genuinely effective cognitive tool that most people have simply learned to suppress rather than outgrow. Your inner processing didn't fail to go fully quiet. It just kept a useful channel open that a lot of people talk themselves out of using. Tell me in the comments if you talk to yourself out loud and what situations bring it out the most. And if you just read this whole video quietly narrating it to yourself under your breath, well, now you know exactly why.